23 bodies were hidden beneath the tobacco fields of Henrico County, Virginia, their graves unmarked and their disappearances planned with chilling precision by two brothers who had turned murder into a business. What started as a harmless bet on a damp September night in 1851 revealed a killing scheme that had been running for more than 10 years, claiming victims across 3 states and generating enough blood money to fund one of the largest tobacco plantations in Virginia. The sheriff's records, sealed away for nearly 70 years, showed that Margaret Carmichael was not the first wife to disappear from the estate, and she was not the first to uncover the family's grisly enterprise. Court documents from Richmond laid out how the Carmichael brothers perfected the art of luring wealthy travelers to Riverside Manor, then eliminating them with such skill that no one ever connected the disappearances to the estate until Margaret's suspicions finally pulled their secrets into the light. Before diving deeper into the Carmichael plantation and the truth buried in its soil, make sure you subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers. The fall of 1851 arrived with an unusual chill in central Virginia, and with it came the scandal that would forever stain one of the most powerful tobacco families in the state. Henrico County spread across rolling hills lined with grand plantation houses, their white columns standing bright against the golden fields of tobacco ready for harvest. The region had flourished during the tobacco boom of the 1840s, with wealthy planters building massive estates along the James River, while merchants, buyers, and bankers traveled constantly between Richmond, Petersburg, and the surrounding plantations, often carrying large sums of cash and operating far from city oversight. The Carmichael estate, called Riverside Manor, spanned through nearly 2,000 acres along the river, making it one of the biggest operations in the area. The 3-story brick and pine manor house boasted wide porches that caught the river breeze, 12 spacious rooms, a grand library, a formal dining hall for 16 and 6 bedrooms decorated with the finest furniture from Philadelphia and Baltimore. The estate's location proved ideal for the brothers' dark purposes, sitting right along the main road between Richmond and Petersburg, where weary travelers often sought shelter. The river made it easy to ship tobacco, and just as easy to dispose of evidence, while dense forests on 3 sides guaranteed privacy. Edmund and Clayton Carmichael inherited Riverside Manor in 1839, along with 47 enslaved workers and crushing debts that threatened their family's legacy. Their father, Josiah Carmichael, had been a respected figure in Virginia politics, but his sudden death left behind a plantation drowning in poor crop prices and gambling losses. Edmund, the elder brother, had a sharp, calculating mind and a ruthless view of profit, his cold blue eyes always weighing every opportunity in terms of what it could earn. Edmund Carmichael stood just over 6 feet tall, with the stiff bearing of a soldier, though his only service had been in the local militia. His years at the College of William and Mary gave him not only an education in finance, but also the kind of social connections that would later grease the wheels of the family's darker ambitions. His letters to Richmond bankers and Petersburg merchants revealed a man who could be charming when he needed to be. But beneath that polish lay a coldness that unsettled even his closest associates. His younger brother Clayton was the opposite in temperament. Slightly shorter but broader in build, Clayton had an easy charisma that made him a favorite among Henrico County's elite. His quick wit, striking good looks, and reputation as a skilled horseman earned him open doors in the wealthiest homes of Virginia. 2 years separated the brothers. Yet together they made a dangerous combination, Edmund with his calculating mind and Clayton with his effortless ability to win trust and gather information, especially about wealthy travelers and their movements. By 1840, their failing plantation began to change course. At first, their offer of food and lodging to passing merchants seemed nothing more than the expected hospitality of southern planters. But as the years went on, the Carmichael brothers discovered just how simple it was to make wealthy strangers vanish without raising suspicion. Richmond, 30 miles to the east, was close enough for commerce, but far enough to shield their activities from scrutiny. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, more interested in keeping the peace than solving mysteries, proved a useful ally. With his political career partly funded by Carmichael contributions and his appetite satisfied at their lavish dinners, Garrett rarely questioned their explanations for disappearances. Meanwhile, Henrico County was a region simmering with national tensions. Slavery's expansion, economic shifts brought by northern industry, and the ever louder debate over states' rights consumed public attention, creating the perfect smokescreen for the brothers' crimes. Against this backdrop, Margaret Denore entered the story. She arrived at Riverside Manor in June of 1851 as Edmund's new bride, the match arranged after they met at a spring social hosted by the Virginia Agricultural Society. Margaret came from a family whose fortunes were fading, and though her dowry was modest, her beauty and social graces made her a valuable partner for Edmund. Her auburn hair, sharp green eyes, and quick mind made her stand out among the young women of her circle. More importantly, her progressive aunt had ensured she received a stronger education than most, training her to read people and situations with unusual clarity. A gift that would eventually lead her closer to the truth about her husband's family. Margaret Carmichael was unlike most planters' wives of her generation. She spoke fluent French, studied botany and natural history, and had a sharp grasp of finance encouraged by her father, despite the era's reluctance to see women engage in such matters. Skills intended to make her a graceful hostess and intellectual companion would soon become the very tools that allowed her to survive and ultimately challenge the Carmichael brothers. Her wedding to Edmund had been nothing short of a spectacle, drawing politicians from Richmond, wealthy landowners from across central Virginia, and even Governor John Floyd, who raised a toast to the promising union. To outsiders, it looked like a strengthening of Virginia's agricultural aristocracy. In the months following her marriage, Margaret wrote glowing letters to her sister in Petersburg. She described Riverside Manor as a palace compared to her family's modest farm in Chesterfield, and praised Clayton's charm and attentiveness, though some neighbors quietly remarked that his enthusiasm toward his brother's bride bordered on excess. Her letters painted vivid pictures of glittering dinner parties, where the elite of Virginia gathered beneath chandeliers to debate politics over imported wines and dishes fit for royalty. Yet even as she marveled at the Carmichaels' wealth, she admitted in passing that their resources seemed curiously abundant for men relying solely on tobacco. By the end of summer, however, Margaret's tone and demeanor began to shift. Friends noticed her distracted gaze during visits, her eyes lingering on the tobacco fields with a haunted look. Her friend Sarah Caldwell later recalled that Margaret seemed troubled, as though she carried the weight of a terrible secret. She ate little, declined social invitations, and excused herself with complaints of headaches and fatigue. The enslaved workers whispered about their mistress's strange habits, long solitary walks, questions about the history of the plantation, and repeated inquiries about previous mistresses who had lived at Riverside. Old Moses, the aging gardener, later told investigators he had seen Margaret digging near the old tobacco barn on several occasions, her movements furtive, always glancing over her shoulder as if she expected to be caught. Then came the night of September 18th, 1851. At first it seemed like any other evening at Riverside Manor. The grand dining hall glittered beneath a crystal chandelier imported from France, the table laid with fine china and silver, every detail designed to project wealth and refinement. Portraits of stern-faced Carmichael ancestors loomed from the walls, their painted eyes following the proceedings with silent judgment. Edmund spoke of crop expansions and business prospects, while Clayton filled the room with stories and gossip from Petersburg. The brothers maintained the illusion of civility, but Margaret, seated between them, sensed the darkness behind their polished conversation, a darkness she was beginning to uncover, piece by piece. Margaret kept her composure at the dinner table, her smile polite, and her words measured, though beneath the surface she was reeling. The tension in her voice hinted at a storm gathering behind her calm exterior. The shift came when Clayton, flushed with bourbon and eager to provoke, leaned back in his chair and with a smirk proposed what he called a gentleman's wager. He claimed he could seduce his brother's wife within 2 weeks, boasting that she would beg him to take her away from what he mockingly described as dreary plantation life. Raising his glass toward her in a drunken toast, he delivered the insult with a lazy confidence that reeked of entitlement. Margaret felt the cruelty of his words like a slap. But what chilled her to the bone was Edmund's reaction. Rather than outrage, her husband simply studied his brother as if he were calculating the price of tobacco. His expression, flickering in the candlelight, turned sharp and predatory. When Edmund finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm. He didn't defend his wife's honor. Instead, he asked what the stakes would be, as though it were nothing more than another business deal. Clayton's grin widened. He proposed $500 and the cancellation of his debt from a land deal, sweetening the pot by adding that if Margaret proved difficult to win over, it would signal she had uncovered something about their family business that needed to be dealt with immediately. The phrase struck Margaret like ice water. She realized then that this wasn't a drunken taunt. It was a veiled admission of something much darker. Her hands trembled as she lifted her glass, struggling to steady her breathing while her mind raced. Edmund, unshaken, pushed the wager further, doubling the stakes to $1,000 and demanding Clayton's share of the North Tobacco fields if he failed. And then came the most terrifying part. If Margaret did become a problem, Edmund said they would resolve the situation in their usual manner and split the cost. The brothers sealed the wager with a handshake and a clink of glasses, as if they were finalizing any other transaction. Margaret sat frozen, her horror mounting with each passing moment. Their casual discussion of her possible death revealed this was far from the first time they had plotted such a thing. Later that night, lying awake in the four-poster bed beside Edmund, she listened to his steady breathing and understood the truth with absolute clarity. The man who had wooed her with poetry and promises of a quiet life among Virginia's aristocracy was not her protector at all. He was a predator, one who could gamble away her dignity and her life as casually as he might place a bet on a horse. Margaret's discovery that both brothers saw her as little more than a prize to be claimed or discarded sparked a cold fury that burned deeper with each passing day. She could not sleep, her mind racing back through every odd occurrence she had brushed aside since arriving at Riverside Manor. The locked rooms Edmund had waved off as storage, the enslaved workers who disappeared without explanation, the guests who had arrived with ceremony yet seemed to vanish without farewells, all now fit into a sinister pattern she could no longer ignore. Clayton wasted no time beginning his so-called wager. With the confidence of a man who had never known rejection, he shadowed her morning walks, offering his arm and conversation. To Margaret's surprise, his charm was more polished than she expected. He spoke with fluency about literature, poetry, and philosophy, quoting lines with ease, and his observations on architecture hinted at travel and education that went far beyond Virginia. He arrived with gifts chosen carefully to appeal to her, an illustrated botanical volume from Richmond, fresh wildflowers gathered into tasteful arrangements, a ribbon that perfectly matched the green of her eyes. Every gesture came wrapped in praise that grew bolder with time, delivered with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to conquest. But Margaret was no ordinary target. Her education, quick intelligence, and the growing certainty that her life hung in the balance sharpened her awareness. She noticed details the brothers thought she would miss, the sudden silences when she entered a room, the fields where workers vanished without explanation, the padlocked doors that hid secrets under the guise of business. Her daily walks became reconnaissance missions. She traced the lines of the plantation, studied the woods that enclosed the estate, and inspected the outbuildings scattered across its sprawling acreage. The more she saw, the more she knew the Carmichaels' crimes went far deeper than adultery or financial deceit. Her suspicions solidified one stormy afternoon late in September. While studying the library's architecture for hidden recesses, her hand pressed against a brick in the fireplace that shifted slightly. Behind it lay a small cavity. Inside was a leather-bound ledger and a collection of belongings, personal trinkets that could only have come from people who were no longer present at Riverside. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the book. Written in Edmund's careful hand, the entries stretched back more than a decade. Each followed the same formula: a name, a date, a location, a physical description, and a sum of money. Thomas Whitaker, September 12, 1842. Richmond Road. Tall brown hair, gold watch. $200. Samuel Chen, March 3, 1843. Petersburg Pike. Short black hair, silk merchant. $150. Father Miguel Santos, July 19, 1844. Church Creek. Medium height traveling priest. $300. Page after page, over 60 names filled the book, each with precise details about appearance, possessions, and wealth. The sums totaled thousands of dollars profits that no plantation could ever achieve through honest farming. It was evidence not of chance robberies, but of a system, a methodical enterprise, built on luring, watching, and eliminating victims with chilling efficiency. Margaret realized in that moment she held proof of the Carmichaels' empire of murder, and perhaps her only chance of survival. At first, Margaret tried to rationalize the ledger. Perhaps it was some hidden record of debts, land speculation, or even slave trading, ugly but not unusual in Virginia's planter class. But the longer she studied the entries, the more she realized this was no ordinary account book. Edmund's meticulous handwriting recorded names, dates, descriptions, and amounts of money. But alongside many of these entries were scrawled notes in Clayton's looser script. The phrases froze her blood. Disposed of according to plan. No complications. No further inquiries expected. And worst of all, Richmond authorities satisfied with explanation, case closed without investigation. At the back of the ledger, Margaret found a hand-drawn map of the plantation grounds, drafted with the precision of a surveyor. It showed not only the manor fields and river access, but also 23 small X's scattered across stretches of woodland and fallow fields. Each X corresponded to an entry in the ledger initials and dates matching the names of men and women who had vanished without a trace. Margaret counted the marks twice, her hands trembling. The truth was undeniable. This was no ledger of business dealings. It was a murder log, a record of systematic killings spanning more than a decade. The items hidden alongside the book confirmed the horror. A wedding band engraved with initials Margaret didn't recognize. A gold pocket watch etched with the name of a Philadelphia merchant. A silver crucifix clearly belonging to a Catholic priest. Coins from distant states, tokens of travelers who had never made it home. Riverside Manor wasn't just a plantation, it was a slaughterhouse draped in respectability. With the eye of someone determined to survive, Margaret began reconstructing the brothers' method. Their estate sat perfectly along the road between Richmond and Petersburg, a prime resting point for weary merchants, planters, clergymen, or immigrants traveling with savings in their pockets. The Carmichaels offered warm meals, fine wine, and a soft bed. Their targets were chosen carefully: lonely travelers, with money people with few ties nearby, victims whose disappearances could be explained away as robbery, accident, or simple misfortune. The pattern revealed itself with terrifying clarity. The brothers had built their fortune not on tobacco, but on blood theft and graves hidden in the fields beyond their grand estate. Margaret narrowed her walks to the X's on the ledger, and what she found made the ledger's horror unmistakable near the old tobacco barn. The ground gave under her feet where soil had been recently turned, and the plants grew richer where something had been buried by the creek. She found scraps of clothing and a brass button, a torn bit of fabric. The broken chain of a pocket watch, small clues that the creek had washed, secrets loose. And then she uncovered a half-collapsed root cellar hidden in the trees. A place once meant for storing food, now altered with drainage toward the creek. Fresh digging tools and chemical jars that hinted at a purpose far darker than preservation. The odor that rose on warm afternoons left no doubt about what the cellar had been used for. Suddenly the plantation she had admired was a graveyard and a workshop for erasing bodies. Fear lodged in her chest, but so did a fierce clarity. The wager at dinner was not drunken cruelty, but a test to see what she knew. Clayton's flirtation was a probe, and his growing boldness showed he was running out of time. He started forcing himself into empty rooms, his hands more urgent, his words less veiled, while Margaret learned to hide alarm under a practiced calm, to answer with the right smile and the right silence as she quietly collected proofs, watching how the brothers froze sensations when she entered, and who vanished from the fields without explanation. The ledger, the ring, the watch, the crucifix, the coins, the disturbed soil, and the cellar all fit into a pattern of careful planning victims, chosen for the ease of their disappearance, traders or clergy, or lone travelers carrying cash. And no local ties, the kind of people whose absence would go unremarked. Then, on the night of September 30th, she listened at the library door and heard them talk, as if they were arranging a shipment. Edmund name-dropping a tobacco buyer from North Carolina, and mentioning an arrival date. He said the man, William Henley, would reach Riverside on October 7th and would likely be carrying $3,000 in cash. Clayton laughed at the prospect, calling it their biggest take yet, and already calculating how it would fund the North Fields. In that moment, Margaret understood the clock was ticking on her own life and on the life of whoever was scheduled to be welcomed through their front gate. He plans to inspect the tobacco on the 8th and finish the sale the next day, which gives them 3 days to finalize the plan, and Edmund even noted that Sheriff Garrett will be visiting family in Richmond that week, so they need not worry about unexpected official visits. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, stomach turning as she listened to the brothers arrange another murder with the same fastidious care they used for business deals. Clayton laying out the timing for after dinner on the 8th, and Edmund confirming the buyer. William Henley would arrive on October 7th, carrying roughly $3,000, the sum large enough to expand the North Fields and leave the brothers comfortably funded for months. But what made Margaret's blood run cold was their talk of her. How Clayton admitted his seduction had not worked, and Edmund, void of feeling, suggested accelerating their schedule and creating a plausible accident to silence her. A fall from a horse or a drowning in the river, methods chosen for credibility and timing. So her family would assume misfortune, not murder, as they discussed. Tools, poisons, believable scenarios, and ways to avoid unwanted attention from Chesterfield. The casual efficiency of their planning, revealing years of refinement and a confidence born of wealth and political ties that made them feel untouchable. Yet in their arrogance they had grown careless in predictable ways, assuming victims would submit and authorities would look the other way. They had not reckoned on Margaret's education, curiosity, and stubborn refusal to be erased, and as she listened, nausea giving way to a cold clarity, she understood she could not run, and that fleeing would only leave her vulnerable, so she made a decision in that moment to fight back and to turn the brothers' own advantages into the means of their downfall. Margaret knew she could not run. Edmund kept a tight grip on the family's finances, and any woman traveling alone in 1851 risked the very dangers the Carmichael brothers had inflicted on so many others. Seeking help from law enforcement was out of the question. The sheriff was either bought or blind. And the family's influence in Henrico County made accusations without hard evidence a death sentence. Her only chance was to turn their arrogance against them, using the very assumptions they held about her supposed weakness as a weapon. If her death at Riverside Manor was inevitable, she resolved it would not be quiet. Justice, if it came, would come through her. She began to prepare in secret. On her daily walks, she studied the fields and woods with the careful discipline of a botanist, collecting knowledge of the poisonous plants that grew freely around the plantation. Water hemlock thrived by the creek, deadly nightshade spread beneath the old oaks, and pokeweed roots concealed toxins that could be extracted with care. Her books told her water hemlock was the most lethal toxin capable of shutting down the nervous system and killing by suffocation. The roots carried the highest concentration, and from them she could brew a liquid that was nearly invisible, nearly tasteless, and almost impossible to detect once slipped into food or drink. At the same time, she began creating a second kind of weapon, a record. In a journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, she copied names and dates from the ledger sketched maps of the burial sites and described everything she had observed in the brothers' methods. She documented their personalities. Edmund's cold precision and obsession with detail. Clayton's impulsive pride and tendency to overreach, and outlined how they selected their victims, how they disposed of bodies, and how they relied on bribery and fear to shield themselves. She even noted which officials could not be trusted, and where investigators should dig if she did not live to tell the story herself. Clayton's frustration at her resistance only grew. His advances becoming more reckless, his temper thinner with each passing day. Margaret learned to vary her routines, never walking alone in isolated places, always ensuring witnesses were nearby. Yet she could see his patience fraying, and with it the risk that the brothers might abandon their timeline and move against her at any moment. When Dr. William Henley, the tobacco buyer from North Carolina, announced his visit, Margaret saw her chance. If she could act swiftly and carefully, she might save Henley's life, expose the Carmichaels, and perhaps survive long enough to see justice done. The stage was set, and October was closing in. Dr. William Henley arrived at Riverside Manor on October 7, 1851, just the sort of man the Carmichaels had hunted for over a decade. He came in a polished carriage behind 2 bay horses, carrying himself with confidence, wealth, and the air of someone respected in his community. Traveling alone with thousands in cash and no close ties in Virginia, he was the perfect mark. The brothers welcomed him with practiced warmth, ushering him into the finest guest chamber, pouring him their best Kentucky bourbon, and engaging him in talk about tobacco markets and politics. To Henley, it felt like good business and better company. To Margaret, watching from behind her careful mask, it was the same performance she had seen before the Last Supper, for a man already marked for death. Henley was more than a planter and trader. His story spanned the South. His knowledge ranged from literature to art to natural history, and his easy manner might have made him an enjoyable companion under any other circumstance. But Edmund's pointed questions about his schedule and family revealed their true purpose, confirming that his disappearance would go unnoticed long enough for them to profit. Clayton's casual probing about Henley's cash and resources was just as telling. By the evening of October 8th, their plan was set. A drugged nightcap followed by suffocation disguised as heart failure, then burial in the soil that had already hidden so many. What the brothers did not see was that Margaret had prepared her own trap. For days she had studied and worked in secret, extracting toxin from water hemlock roots and distilling it into a nearly invisible liquid. She knew the dosage each man's body weight required and understood the brothers' nightly ritual well enough to time her move. Edmund always selected and opened the bourbon in the library before serving it. Margaret used that moment to slip her poison into the bottle, ensuring it would strike not just Edmund and Clayton, but also Henley. It was a choice made with a cold calculation. Leaving either Carmichael alive would guarantee her death. As for Henley, She bore no illusions. His murder had already been decided by the brothers. His inclusion in the poisoned toast would make him appear another victim of their cruelty, not her accomplice in their downfall. That night, as the glasses were raised and the amber bourbon caught the flicker of candlelight, Margaret knew the moment had come when predator and prey would change places. And just when you thought Henrico County's horrors could go no further, this deadly game of deception reached its final act. If this story chills you, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because Margaret Carmichael's last move was about to bring the Carmichael Empire crashing down. The dinner had gone exactly as the brothers planned. 7 courses of polished conversation and laughter, while Margaret sat calm and collected inside, and the next morning they played the part of gracious hosts while secretly waiting for the payoff. She excused herself before the final drinks with a practiced complaint about a headache and watched from her window as Edmund Clayton and their guest moved into the library, unaware that the night would not end, as any of them expected. An uneasy quiet settled over the house, and then around 11, the library erupted in alarm. A chair crashed, glass shattered, and voices rose in panic as Dr. Henley first suggested something in their food had gone wrong in Edmund. Usually the picture of control realized with mounting horror that the bourbon had betrayed them, his words slurring as his body betrayed him, while Clayton fared better at first because he had nursed his drink and still had the strength to move and think. His voice cutting through the chaos with a raw, accusing edge as he screamed Margaret's name over and over, calling her a witch and promising vengeance. The sound of his footsteps thudded across the floorboards like a drumbeat of doom, and Margaret pressed herself against the bedroom wall. Heart pounding, but mind clear. Every instinct honed by days of fear and planning as she watched the corridor below for the shadow of his approach. She had not wanted to kill any more than necessary. But she had made choices she could not undo, and now faced the moment when those choices collided with violence. The house seemed to hold its breath as Clayton's search grew louder and angrier, and Margaret steeled herself for whatever came next. Deciding in that instant she would not be dragged silently into the earth without answering for the lives stolen from the fields she loved. Each stumble and crash marked Clayton's slow climb up the stairs, and Margaret realized with a cold shock that she'd misjudged the poison's timing. He was still mobile, driven by a furious need for revenge. So she grabbed the fireplace poker, the only weapon at hand, and waited as his labored breaths drew closer. He burst into the doorway, pale and sweating, ranting between convulsions about Edmund's first wife, Catherine, about Sarah Caldwell, about the sheriff's daughter who had supposedly found the ledger. Each name a new confirmation of how deep the brothers' crimes ran and fueling Margaret's resolve. Clayton lunged with Edmund's hunting knife, wild and uncoordinated, because the toxin had already begun to wreck his nervous system, and Margaret struck his wrist with the poker hard enough to send the blade skittering across the floor. He fell to his knees, spasms racking his body. His threats turning into ragged cries as the water hemlock finished its work. Below, the library had fallen into eerie silence, except for the occasional convulsive sound from Dr. Henley and the final quiet from Edmund. And when the house finally stilled, Margaret found herself alone with 3 dead men and the knowledge that she had traded her safety for the chance to stop more murders. All through the dawn, she worked with grim focus, arranging the library, so the deaths would look like a tragic poisoning and a fraternal murder-suicide that included an unfortunate guest leaving Clayton, where he had fallen to support the story that he had attacked her before collapsing from the same poison while she hid copies of the ledger. Sketched maps and notes about burial sites and places she trusted would be searched by investigators beyond Henrico County. She hoped this careful staging would expose the brothers' crimes to authorities who could not be bought and give the victims some measure of justice, even if she never lived to see it. The broken hunting knife, her bruised arms, and the cuts she bore told the story of a woman who had fought for her life against a dying man's desperate rage. But Margaret knew that survival alone was not enough. If the truth about Riverside Manor was to be revealed, she had to leave behind evidence so thorough that no sheriff, no magistrate, and no politician could bury it. She retrieved Edmund's ledger from its hiding place in the fireplace and gathered every page of her own notes. The copied entries, the mapped graves, her descriptions of their methods, and her analysis of how the Carmichaels had chosen and disposed of their victims. Together, these documents formed a record too detailed to ignore. She then wrote a careful account of the events leading to the brothers' deaths, shaping it into a narrative that painted her as the terrified wife who had stumbled upon a monstrous truth and who had acted only out of desperation. When neighbors discovered the bodies 3 days later, alerted by Margaret's trembling account of hiding in the tobacco fields after witnessing the tragedy, the investigation unfolded exactly as she had intended. Sheriff Garrett, usually a pliant ally to the Carmichaels, could not dismiss the deaths of such prominent men in the company of a wealthy out-of-state tobacco buyer. Margaret wept, recounted her husband's madness, and claimed she had fled the manor in terror. The untouched cash in Dr. Henley's room bolstered her story. It looked like a murder-suicide born of greed and family strife rather than robbery. The turning point came when Margaret discovered the ledger and her notes among her late husband's effects and handed them to Garrett anonymously. What they contained shocked not only Henrico County, but the entire Commonwealth. Investigators began digging at the X's marked on Edmund's map. One by one, the shallow graves yielded the remains of 23 people. Merchants, travelers, clergymen, immigrants, men and women whose names had long been whispered in missing persons reports, now tied together in a single grisly pattern. Among the bodies was a woman buried near the creek, still wrapped in the remnants of a silk wedding gown. Her jewelry and personal effects confirmed what Margaret already knew. Catherine Phillips, Carmichael Edmund's first wife, had not died of consumption in 1847, as recorded on her death certificate. Her murder had been staged and signed off by a compliant doctor. Catherine's bones lay not in the Carmichael family plot, but in the earth among the brothers' other victims, another wife silenced for knowing too much. The unmasking of Edmund and Clayton Carmichael revealed one of the most chilling murder enterprises in American history. For more than a decade, the brothers had preyed on travelers, enriching themselves with blood money while maintaining the facade of refinement and respectability. And it was Margaret, the woman they underestimated, who finally ended their reign and ensured the truth would be unearthed. The false death certificate for Catherine Carmichael led investigators straight to Dr. Elias Brennan, the family physician who had signed her life away. Brennan's arrest uncovered a hidden layer of corruption. He had been accepting payments from the Carmichael brothers for years, quietly filing fraudulent medical reports that disguised their victims' deaths as illnesses, accidents, or other natural causes. His confession pulled back the curtain on how the Carmichaels managed to kill for more than a decade without meaningful suspicion. The case grew into one of Virginia's most infamous trials, exposing rot far beyond Riverside Manor. Officials in Henrico County were unmasked for taking bribes or looking the other way, choosing their careers and social standing over the safety of travelers who vanished by the score. The brothers had exploited their wealth and reputation so effectively that respectable society itself had become their shield. Margaret inherited Riverside, but found it uninhabitable in every sense. The land's reputation was ruined, buyers refused to touch it, and even when crops were planted, they withered in soil enriched by human remains. Whether this was contamination or curse, no one could say. She sold the estate to the state of Virginia at a loss, using the money to create a fund for victims' families and to improve law enforcement training in rural areas, an attempt to ensure that no one else would suffer from such unchecked corruption. Within a year, the manor house was torn down, its bricks scattered, and its grounds abandoned back to wilderness. Sheriff Garrett, in his final report, called Margaret courageous and credited her with saving untold lives by exposing the truth. He wrote nothing about her possible role in the brothers' deaths, choosing instead to preserve the story of the grieving widow who had uncovered horrors too great for one woman to bear. Her careful planting of evidence, her anonymous delivery of the ledger, and her performance as a traumatized survivor left authorities with a clear narrative that absolved her of suspicion. The fund she created for the victims' families softened the blow of years of unanswered grief. Margaret herself slipped quietly into obscurity, reportedly relocating to Baltimore under another name. Letters whispered back to Virginia suggested she found peace in charitable work and in her old love botany. But to the people of Henrico County, she remained the woman who had faced down monsters and ended one of the darkest chapters in Virginia's history. The Riverside Manor case changed the culture of travel across the South. Inns, plantations, and roadside estates offering hospitality faced sharper scrutiny. Law enforcement patrols along main thoroughfares increased. And for every traveler who tightened their guard against the lure of strangers' generosity, Margaret's story became a caution that beneath the veneer of refinement and wealth could lurk unimaginable cruelty, and that justice sometimes required taking matters into your own hands. Margaret Carmichael's choices did more than end the reign of two killers. They ripped open the web of corruption that had shielded the brothers for years. Riverside's tobacco fields, once a symbol of wealth and prosperity, became cursed ground where nothing would grow. Farmers tried again and again to reclaim the land, but crops withered as though the soil itself remembered the bodies buried beneath it. Some said it was contamination from the graves. Others whispered that the land carried a stain no plow could erase. The shock of the case echoed far beyond Henrico County. For the first time, Virginia's legislature forced sheriffs to coordinate across county lines on missing person reports, and oversight committees were established to keep officials accountable. These reforms were born from the realization that the Carmichaels had thrived not just because of their cruelty, but because a system meant to protect the vulnerable had failed at every level. Yet the most remarkable part of the story is Margaret herself. In a world where women were expected to remain silent, she used her intelligence, her education, and her courage to bring down men who believed themselves untouchable. She risked everything: her safety, her reputation, even her soul, to stop the murders. Her actions showed that justice doesn't always come from institutions or courts. Sometimes it takes someone the world underestimates to stand up and fight back, even if it means crossing lines society would never forgive. The ultimate irony is that Edmund's obsession with order, the ledger he treated as a business necessity, became the very key to unraveling their crimes. His careful records of names, dates, and sums turned into a roadmap of murder that investigators could not ignore. What was meant to preserve control instead exposed the truth. So now the question is yours: was Margaret right to take justice into her own hands? Or should she have sought another way? Was she a victim who fought back, or something more? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this story left you haunted, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share it with a friend who loves chilling mysteries from history. Until next time, remember, sometimes justice wears an unexpected face.